everybody. Welcome to PCS 101. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 20th of April. And as I indicated, we have a smaller class than we started with. We, at this point, have 14 students in class. So I made some adjustments to the course outline so that we could slow down a little bit. So last class, I asked you to basically review the speeches of your classmates and to send me a strength and weakness. And you can see that I've included all of this peer feedback in the notes below for all of the speeches, so you can read the feedback for yourself as well as for the feedback for your peers. And I would have sent you my feedback for your particular speech with your grade. So you should receive that, and you'll see that I used a template for the first speech, and that was the template that's included in the syllabus and other documents folder. I won't even use that template for the second or the third speech. I will just take notes of places where I see strains to places where I see areas for improvement. And now that we've completed the first speech, congratulations, and you've been able to test some of the skills that we've been talking about thus far. As I indicated, I wanted to put most of the readings up front so that you could use all of that information for your speech. And I also wanted us to get a little bit of a sense of who was in the class. Now we're ready to go to speech 2. And speech 2, as I had indicated previously, is an informative speech of 10 minutes. So you have doubled the time of what you had with speech 1. And basically, an informative speech is where you get to teach the audience something or show them how to do something. So this speech is going to be slightly different, not just in terms of length, but also in terms of my asking you to use an audio or a visual. And we're going to be talking about that today, what kinds of audios or visuals you could use if you wanted to. And some of you elected to do that in the first speech, but you weren't required to. I didn't want you to have to worry about an audio visual, as well as worrying about things like deep breathing, for instance, and introductions and bodies and conclusions. So that speech will be on April 27th, which is on Tuesday, which is a week from today. I had originally scheduled 2 classes for that speech, but since we've got only 14 students, we can do it all in one class. And if you are going to upload your speech via Moodle, it'll be very similar to what you did with speech 1. I will have an area at the top of Moodle where you can upload speech number 2, and you are being asked to upload that on the 27th, Tuesday, by 11:59 p.m. If it turns out that you think you want to deliver your speech live via Zoom, please contact me before the 27th. Let me know what your hours of availability are on the 27th. I'll put together all of that information and try to find a common time for individuals who want to present via Zoom, if anybody wants to present via Zoom. And much like I asked last time, please contact me so that we can make some sort of an arrangement to touch base for practicing for your second speech. So send me an email. Let me know if you would like to meet via Zoom and we can set up a time. Or if you'd like to have a phone conversation, we can set up a time. Or a chat or an email or whatever works best for you, just so that we can touch base about what you're thinking about doing for that informative speech. And I usually suggest to students that you might want to choose a topic that you already have some familiarity with. That said, there's nothing stopping you from going out and finding new information, but just in terms of some of the challenges with time, because this is a condensed class, this half semester class is very similar to what you would have in a summer session. You might want to choose something that you already have some knowledge about to save you some time. So it could be something that's a hobby or an interest of yours, or it could be something that perhaps you've learned in another class. It could be something that you've written a paper about that you can adapt for a speech. So basically, on page 196, if it turns out that you are using the textbook edition that I had ordered for the class, you can see that they've got some ideas there where you could talk about people or places or things or events or procedures for informative speeches. Again, you've got 10 minutes in order to do that with some sort of audio and visual. Now, normally we would be meeting in person and then we would have some sort of a question and answer period, which could be the case if we are meeting via Zoom. And if that's the case, you want to incorporate some sort of question and answer period if you are presenting your speech live. But obviously, if you're recording your speech, you're not necessarily going to be able to answer questions. So try to anticipate and address the question that an average audience member might ask, so that you are trying to be as thorough as possible. You can give a speech where you explain, basically you tell something, or you can give a speech where you demonstrate, you show us how to do something. And I've seen both, and they're both great. A lot of the demonstration speeches are very popular because they include audience involvement. Again, that's going to be a little bit more challenging with the way that our semester is going as an online class. But that said, you can always think about, your typical cooking show that you might have watched on TV, and it's harder than it seems. You've got to do a good amount of prep work and so forth, and you've got to get into your 10-minute area and so forth. Limit your points. 10 minutes is not very much, and remember what we had talked about in terms of people's memories and people's attention spans, that both tend to be very short. You probably also want to use some repetition now that you are teaching us something so that we don't forget, probably more so than you would use if you were writing. You want to use transitions. You want to be really clear to show the connections between things. You want to avoid jargon, which is specialized language that is used in a particular profession. You're assuming an intelligent but general audience, that there isn't an audience that has specialized knowledge in law or medicine or anything in that case. Clustering like ideas. This is a memory technique that oftentimes is used where you're putting like things together. Think about how telephone numbers are oftentimes clustered into 3 digits and then 4 digits, again, to help us remember things. Associating new things with old things. That's an old teacher trick. You've probably seen this in math classes where you're building on previous knowledge. Repetition, again, as I indicated, that's one of the best ways to help your audience remember if you're repeating things. People have different learning styles, different ways that they learn. Some learn through visuals, some learn through audio, some learn through tactile experiences. And the more modalities that you can utilize in a speech, the more likely it is your audience will learn and understand. It's one of the reasons why teachers will use a whiteboard, or why I've included notes beneath these videos. So in addition to your seeing me and also hearing me, you can also read the important points that I would have put on a whiteboard if we were meeting in class. Sometimes you need to motivate an audience to be interested in your topic. I'm well aware of this when I teach Shakespeare, that oftentimes my students aren't necessarily that interested in Shakespeare. So I'm trying to the best of my ability to talk about how Shakespeare has contemporary relevance in order to motivate them to have a certain level of interest. Some of the speeches can be speeches that I call public service speeches, where you're giving information that an individual could use outside of the context of the class. I've seen lots of speeches about things like fire safety. I've seen lots of speeches about things like CPR, things of that nature. So I do remember an informative speech that was about skin cancer. Can't remember if I told this story. And one of the audience members asked the speaker, to show one of the slides again, because the audience member had a mole that was very similar to the image that the speaker had shown. And the audience member was very concerned. The speaker suggested that the audience member go to the doctor because the speaker's not a doctor. And luckily everything was fine. But can you imagine if somebody had discovered that they had skin cancer through a speech in class? So there are lots of different ways you can go about, again, visual media as well. And it could be audio as well as visual. You can go low tech to high tech. You can use things like whiteboards, and this could be just as simple as just putting a sheet of paper or whiteboard behind you, or poster board behind you or in front of you. Pictures tend to work very well in terms of motivating emotions and activating emotions. Props can be wonderful, and we saw some props in the first speech. Again, you have to think about things like how easy is it to manipulate? Is it visible? You can use video and audio clips as well. Keep in mind balance. You've got a 10-minute speech, so I wouldn't do more than 3 minutes of video or audio. If you were giving an hour speech, perhaps you could give 10 minutes of video or audio, but you wouldn't want to do that with the 10-minute speech. And again, if you are presenting via Zoom, then you have to think about how you would be going about showing that information. And if you're recording, you also need to think about how you would go about showing that information. Flip charts. if you've ever heard the term. It was really what PowerPoint was before there was a PowerPoint. It was just a large pad of paper with different sheets of paper that basically would be flipped through by the speaker one at a time. And the speaker would determine when to flip the page, or basically when to show the information. So those are the kind of early days of PowerPoint, and that can work as well. Zoom screen sharing, of course. I used to talk about handouts. If we're not meeting in person, that's going to be probably too challenging. A handout is very useful if you want your audience to walk away with some information, or if there is sensitive information that you're afraid that an audience member doesn't want to be seen writing down. You can include that in a handout. Regardless of what audio or visual you use, you want to try to be as professional as possible. You want to test your equipment beforehand and be prepared for technological difficulties. So again, if we were presenting the speech live and there were technological difficulty, well then the idea isn't that the speech stops, is that you find a way around the technical difficulty. Again, with Zoom, it might be a little bit different, because if Zoom crashes, we obviously are not presenting our speech. But again, if you were in class and you were using PowerPoint and let's say your program crashed, then the idea is that you would continue on with your speech and probably use the whiteboard in lieu of PowerPoint. I always recommend to my students that the outlines that they use for speeches, and you're required to submit an outline for this speech, very similar to the outline you submitted in for speech 1. But I think it's a good idea to have your outline on paper rather than to use a computer. In the event that there are technological difficulties, then you aren't left without an outline. At least you've got some sort of a hard copy there. Charts work very nicely with numbers to help your audience visualize numbers, which oftentimes can be very difficult to conceptualize. Pictures, as I said, work very well in terms of emotions, and we're made up of both intellect and emotions, so you want to try to appeal to both. You want to be clear with your speech and also your audio visuals. You want to be simple and you want to be neat. You don't want to use too many colors, fonts, things of that nature. You want to make sure that it's visible to your audience. You want to, again, consider scale, balance, and proportion. Yes, use color for interest, but again, don't overuse. Avoid all capital letters. It's very difficult to read something that's completely in all capitals. Do watch your spelling, because if you are putting something in a larger font, then you are drawing attention to it, and the last thing you want is a spelling error. I know that usually when I talk about audio visuals in normal circumstances, people think about PowerPoint. I have nothing against PowerPoint, but I have seen PowerPoint misused and abused, where the PowerPoint is a substitute for the speech. The speaker is basically just reading off of the slides, and that's not what we want. We want interaction. We want you to be conversational with us as an audience, even if you are just speaking with the camera. I've seen that the PowerPoint is not necessarily synced to the speech. I've seen situations where there's too many fonts, colors, or it's just not visible. So there are lots of different ways that a PowerPoint can go bad. But again, there are lots of ways that you could go about an audio and visual. It doesn't have to be PowerPoint. Just something to illustrate that you are engaging the audience. It's more likely that your audience will understand and your audience will be engaged if you are using an audio or a visual, because you can appeal to different learning styles. One of the things we can talk about in the practice session is not only your topic, but also what audio visual are you considering using for the speech, and how are you going to incorporate that into the speech. Now, I had assigned one last chapter, supporting materials, chapter 6, for today. You are not, I repeat, you are not required to use outside resources. But that said, you may want to use outside resources to look up information for your informative speech. You will, however, be required to use outside resources for your third and final speech. Your third speech will be a persuasive speech. You will have 15 minutes to try to convince us to either support a belief or to engage in an action, or both. And I'm going to ask you to use 3 outside resources, and it doesn't matter what resources you use. They can be print or electronic, and they can be any combination thereof. And it's fairly easy to incorporate that into a speech, much easier than it would be to incorporate in a paper. As you know, when you're writing, there are very specific rules for documentation, and those rules are oftentimes dependent on discipline. So there's a specific set of rules in the MLA, Modern Language Association, for the humanities, and that also includes public speaking. There's slightly different set of rules for the APA, or the American Psychological Association, and that's for the sciences. But the purpose of the rules are similar, is to give the reader enough information so that they could find the original quote if they so needed to verify it. And again, when you're speaking, you don't necessarily want to inundate the audience with all of the detail that you would give if you were writing. So it's usually just enough to give a tag. In other words, just to let the audience know that the information you're sharing is not yours. For instance, something as simple as saying, according to studies, 10% of those interviewed. So it's clear in the way that I've constructed this sentence that these are outside studies. Now, I should be prepared to be able to indicate where those studies came from and when they were conducted. So I should have that information somewhere, whether it be my head or my notes, so I can share that with an audience if I were asked. But basically, that's enough for your audience to know that the information you're sharing is from an outside source. So that's fine. And then what I'm going to ask you to do for that third and final speech is just to list your sources, the 3 or more. I stopped counting after 3. Just like with your second speech, with your audio visual, you need to use just one. You can use many more after that, but I stopped counting after 1. But for your last speech, where you are using outside resources, I'm going to ask that you just list those outside resources in your speaking outline that you submit into me so that I can take a quick look. And I'm not asking for it in any particular format, MLA or APA. And I want to try to keep this as realistic as possible. If you were presenting a speech, I'm pretty sure that an audience, if they had a question, they would just want to know the basics, things like author and title, place of publication, publisher. Wouldn't necessarily have to be in any particular kind of format. But we'll talk about that more when we get to our third and final speech. Though certainly you can begin thinking now about the third speech. And I've had students who basically decide that they want all 3 speeches of the semester to be connected. So the informative speech, speech 2, is based on something that they might have talked about in their first speech, their autobiographical speech. And then their persuasive speech is based on that thing that they talked about in their informative speech. That said, they can be completely separate topics, but I might have talked about how I am, let's say, a pug owner in my autobiographical speech, which I am. In my informative speech, I might have informed you about the breed pugs, and my persuasive speech could be to try to persuade you that the next time you are in the market for an animal, that you should have and choose a pug. And you can see that this is a persuasive speech that doesn't have a lot of level of controversy to it, which is fine. You can decide how much or how little controversy you want with your persuasive speech. But remember, the informative speech is where you're teaching us. The persuasive speech is where you're trying to convince us. Though, of course, there are elements of convincing in all speeches, including your first speech, your autobiographical, where you're trying to convince us as audience that what you were sharing with us was important. And there's elements of information in all speeches. So in your autobiographical speech, you were giving us information. In your informative speech, you will probably be trying to convince us that the information you're sharing with us is important. And I wouldn't at all be surprised if in your informative speech you made reference to yourself, a little bit of your biography. And lastly, the persuasive speech, you are going to need to use information. That's one of the ways that you persuade someone. And also, you probably will make reference to yourself. So you can see how all of these kind of relate, but the focus of speech 2, which is where we are now, is the informative speech. Now, if you are using any kind of supporting materials for speech 2, or definitely for speech 3, keep in mind that using outside materials increases credibility and persuasiveness, which is one of the reasons why I'm asking you to do that. You want to make sure that you're using accurate resources. And I know that most students just think, well, I'll go on Google. And I have nothing against Google, but as you know, it's the wide open web and anybody can post anything, which is wonderful and also terrible because you might have inaccurate information. And as a GCC student, you have access to more reliable resources. So I encourage you not to just go to Google and instead to go to the GCC library. And I've indicated below the website. And you can see that in addition to all of the library resources, we have databases. In other words, electronic resources that look like what you would find on Google, but they aren't open to everyone. These are sources that have been vetted. In other words, these are staff members who are employed to review the information to check for its accuracy. That said, we can't be 100% foolproof that something is accurate, but definitely the idea is that it's much more foolproof than something you would find on the wide open web. And I'll never forget what someone once told me about the difference between using a database and using Google. And they likened it to having safe and unsafe sex. And they said that using Google was similar to unsafe sex. And that you'd probably be okay, but do you want to take the risk? And they said that using the databases was like safe sex. Yes, it's possible something can go wrong, but not probable. So perhaps you can think about it in that way. So I do encourage you to use the library resources. And remember, their libraries have old-fashioned books. I know, again, this is a challenging time, but you can always do an interlibrary loan, or perhaps you have access to materials yourself. But I have no problem with you using all electronic if that would be the case. And in fact, you can even use interviews. If the assumption is that the person that you are interviewing has a certain level of expertise in the subject which you are discussing. And of course, you are showing ethos. You're being as ethical as possible and making sure that that person knows how you're going to be using their interview and that they've given permission for you to use their interview. And if they don't want their name disclosed, you're making sure that you're protecting their privacy and so forth. So the different kinds of resources you can use, you can have primary and secondary. Primary is first-hand accounts. In other words, eyewitness. Secondary is based on the primary, so it's scholarship, for instance, and both are useful. It's useful, for instance, if you want to know about war, to get a primary account. In other words, somebody who's actually there and experienced it. But it's also useful to get a secondary account. That this is basically somebody who has studied the war. So a combination of the two. Just like qualitative evidence, which is based on stories and anecdotes, can be very useful, and quantitative evidence, which is based on facts and numbers, can be useful. So it's useful, for instance, to know about students' experiences at GCC, and we can do that qualitatively by asking them about what they thought were strengths and weaknesses of the school. But we can also look at quantitative data. We can look at things like graduation rates, for instance, and transfer rates. And again, one isn't necessarily better than another. I think they complement one another. And again, all of this on supporting material will probably be much more relevant for our third and final speech. But just in the event that for the informative speech you wanted to do some outside research, these are some things for you to consider. And for our next class, what it is we're going to be doing is quiz number 2. So you can see that, again, it'll be very similar to what we did with quiz number 1. It'll be 20 questions, open book, open notes, mostly short answer, but some true, false, and a few perhaps a few longer questions, but basically it's mostly short answer and or multiple choice is the word I was looking for. And I'll ask you to send that to me via my email on PDF so that I can return that quiz to you, evaluate it, much like I did with the first quiz. And the quiz will cover the materials that we've been discussing and some of the readings that we've been discussing. And ultimately, I'm also hopeful that the quiz will address points that in one way or another would be important for you to consider when you are presenting your second speech and all of your speeches, basically. And what I wanted to do to end today's class is to give you 2 sample informative speeches that I found on YouTube. Again, both of these speeches are in no way affiliated with GCC. And what I wanted you to do is to watch both of them. And obviously, there's some things you can't comment on, things like volume. That's something that you can adjust on your computer, or length. They weren't necessarily delivering a 10-minute speech for our class. But there are other things that you can comment on: the introduction, the body, the conclusion, the way that they were able to teach the audience or give information to the audience. And your attendance question for today, which will be due on Wednesday, the 21st at noon, on our class discussion forum, is for you to list one strength and one weakness of both of these sample informative speeches above. One strength and one weakness of both of these sample informative speeches above. And again, you don't have to necessarily respond to your classmates, but I do encourage you to read your classmates' responses, because these speeches and your classmates' responses to them will help inform what you do or don't do when you are putting together your own informative speech. But again, do contact me so that we can set up a way to connect so that we can talk about your informative speech. And if you think you want to deliver your informative speech live via Zoom, please also send me an email with your times of availability for the 27th, and I'll try to find a common time. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And in terms of the rest of the semester, after we have presented the informative speech, we have a little bit of wiggle room, depending on how many students are left in the class. If we're still at 14 or if we're even lower, then we can make any adjustments as necessary for the final speech. But you can see that we've got some time there so that we can alter dates and slow down a little bit if necessary. So again, I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and I will have a quiz for you next class. Take care. Bye-bye.